I'm going to be talking about the intersection of spirituality and psychology. And I've got to give a disclaimer here because what we're talking about is fundamentally mysterious. If there's somebody who says they really understand how our souls interact with our bodies, or they understand the true nature of spiritual warfare, or how angels intercede in our lives, I think the best thing to do is smile politely and back away slowly. Now, it doesn't mean that there's not good theology about this. There's lots of good theology, there's lots of good writing about this, but to have a felt experience, to deeply understand it, our human brains are too limited. We're too small to be able to really grasp it. So I'm going to be doing my best here this morning to give some of my own thoughts on this. And now that I've disqualified myself from having anything useful to say, why don't we just kind of dive in? Now, I believe that psychological health and spiritual health, they're both 100% necessary for true fulfillment in life. And I think also it's hard to have one without the other. Maybe it's not impossible, but it's very hard. A lot of people that I've challenged on this, I've said, you can't have a healthy spirituality without healthy psychology. People have pushed back on that and have given me the example of Mother Teresa. Many of you have probably heard that Mother Teresa had depression. And if you read some of her journal writings, you'll see there's definitely some strong trends of depression here. That's not what I'm talking about. So like Michelle was talking about, you can think of like our soul, our being, as being kind of like a lake. And on the surface, our lake has different levels, different layers. On the surface of our lake, there is all kinds of chaos can be happening. But then deep down underneath the layers of the lake, you can be possessed of like deep calm, deep mental health. So like right now, my like stress level about the technology, it's pretty high, but I'm also happy and joyful to be talking to you guys this morning. So surface of the lake, kind of stressed out. Deep down underneath the lake, it's much happier. Now, let's take this and imagine thinking of this in terms of fulfillment in life. So, like I was saying, holiness and psychological happiness, they go hand in hand. It's hard to picture somebody who is spiritually healthy but is psychologically unhealthy. Now, super important caveat here. I'm not talking exactly about holiness. I know some people who have really serious mental health problems and are way holier than I'm ever going to be. In particular, for years I worked with this guy who struggled with schizophrenia, and the detachment he developed, the detachment he was able to develop as he coped with schizophrenia and battled through it was amazing. But what he would say is his experience of mental health problems also clouded his understanding of God's love for him. So you can't help but see the whole world around you through the lens with which you see the world, right? And our mental health is part of what makes up that lens. So if you have somebody whose deep psychology has been wounded, like somebody with a personality disorder, somebody who's maybe experienced a deep trauma in their life, it's harder for them to really deeply understand and experience God's love. So let's talk about how these things work together, psychology and spirituality. Psychology and spirituality are both rooted in what St. Ignatius would call the heart. And the heart is the deepest part of our being. It's where we experience God's love. It's where God dwells in our heart. And our psychology and our spirituality both grow up out of our heart. They proceed from the heart. So our spirituality and our psychology, they grow up out of the depths of our heart. So if we have an unhealthy heart, then both our psychology and our spirituality are going to be wounded. They're going to be damaged. Now, spirituality is different than our spirit. Our spirituality is our spirit sort of made manifest in our life. It's how we respond to God's love. And then deep down inside, both is where our heart is intersected with our spirit, our mind, and our body. It's a hard thing to understand, so I'll try and do my best here to give you an analogy. A lot of times we kind of think of our souls as kind of being a hand in a glove. So our spirit is kind of inhabits our body, and then when we die, we fly off to heaven. It's actually much more, we're much more interconnected than that. It's much more of an intimate fusion of mind, body, and spirit, and it's fundamentally mysterious, and we don't understand it. But this is why psychological health, physical health, spiritual health, relational health, it all comes together. It's all one. You can't have one without the other ones kind of being in place. There's an analogy from St. Thomas Aquinas and from Aristotle, who talks about the soul. You can imagine it being the imprint of a stamp upon a ball of wax. So, like, think about when you go to Mass on Sundays, those families, that they just have to be so perfect and put together, and like they're all dressed in the same outfit, and it's so cute. And then they jump in the car and they're like screaming at each other, and it's a mess. We all know those. We all know them, right? Actually, like, I think most of us actually kind of want to be that family. I know I try to be that family. Of course we want to look good in front of other people. It's totally normal human nature. I dropped that a year or so ago when I took my kids to Mass. And we have these good friends who, they're not that family, but they dress up for Mass. And I'm just like, wow, that's amazing. They've got like 9 kids. They dress up for Mass. They look really good. So we're going to do that. It lasted a week because one of my kids, he was wearing a short sleeve polo shirt with a clip-on tie that was like hanging down. And it's like, no, that's just not the Langley way. It's just not gonna work. I think we should all just take a vote and just drop that whole being the perfect family at Mass charade. None of us are the perfect family. We're all a mess. If we could just admit it, it would be great. Another example is I'm friends with some priests, and they'll oftentimes talk about their experience in seminary. Father, you can weigh in on this. They'll often talk about their experience in seminary after Mass. What they'll do is they'll kneel and they'll be praying after Mass and Thanksgiving, but none of them want to get up. No one wants to be the first person to get up, and they're on like bloody knees, and they are not going to be the first one to get up and go. Well, they're not actually praying. They're just trying to beat their buddies and like show them just how holy they are. And it's human nature. This is how we are, right? We all want to act better than we are, and we kind of co-opt our spirituality to make that happen sometimes. There's another subtle lesson there. Wherever you go, there you are. I think there's a song about that, right? Even when we're doing something that's our most holy, maybe it's marriage, maybe it's the priesthood or whatever, we still bring that false self right along with us. The false self can be healed, but it can't be escaped. The other way number 2, that I think people can sort of use their spirituality as a defense mechanism, and this is, I think, kind of the most insidious. It's when you use your spirituality to justify your own brokenness, your own bad habits, your own ways of hurting other people, to justify basically the bad things about you. So I'll give you a few examples because this one's kind of subtle. I've worked in couples therapy with a million different couples who they have maybe a super traditional view of marriage, and there's nothing wrong with a super traditional view of marriage, but each spouse, a husband can justify treating his wife very terribly because he's like, we're an Ephesians 5 family and you will submit to me. This is holy. Or on the flip side, I've worked with couples who are so addicted to the other person's happiness, and it's usually one spouse addicted to another spouse's happiness, where they don't stand up for themselves, they don't really have much of a sense of identity apart from the relationship. They're not an individual. They just kind of serve the almighty spouse. And this is, husbands and wives can both do this with each other. Well, God wants us to be selfless, but he doesn't want us to be codependent. The third way The third way, I think, is when we over-spiritualize our problems and use it as a way to sort of justify not having to do anything about it. So sometimes I'll be in therapy with a person and they'll just, oh, I am in this terrible marriage, but this is where God wants me to be, and I'm just going to, I don't want to stand up for myself, and even though I feel abused, because that's holy. And here's the subtle thing that this does. It frees you from the responsibility of your life. If it's a spiritual struggle, and purely a spiritual struggle from God, well, you don't have to do anything. Of course we have spiritual struggles, but I really believe that one reason why God gives us these struggles is he wants us to take responsibility for our lives. I think that's like a really important thing. Now, we can't have this discussion, I think, without me weighing in a little bit on the nature of spiritual warfare. But again, I have to give another disclaimer. I am not an exorcist, and I do not play one on TV. I am not an expert in this area. But I have a couple of examples I actually want to share with you that might help give a little bit of insight. I've consulted on a number of different deliverance cases. Sometimes my own therapy clients getting deliverance ministry, other times people getting sent to me. And there's this, I'll give you an example of one guy I worked with who he was seeing me weekly. He was doing weekly deliverance ministry for a long time, and nothing worked. He wasn't being freed from anything. He was just as stuck, just as miserable as he ever was. And he had this, he believed that when he was in college, a demon possessed him when he was dabbling in occult practices that were all about divining the future, figuring out his future, knowing, just what to do. And this demon came to him apparently and said that, I'll be your guide as long as you surrender all of your control over to me. Just give me all the control. And this guy apparently consented to this, and the demon took over his life, that's what he believed. Well, time goes on in therapy. We're working, we're making some insight progress, and it comes out that this guy is pathologically dependent and always has been. So he can't get rid of his demon because he doesn't want to get rid of his demon. How awesome is it to just have this inner guide that will tell me what to do with everything that I do? The second example is probably more delusional than demonic. So I was working with a woman who believed that she was the unwitting bride of Satan, and every night Satan would visit her and would tell her, how she's the queen of the underworld and how that's so special. But this woman is a practicing Catholic, doesn't want to be the bride of Satan. So this was very, very distressing for her. She doesn't want to do this. Again, she's making no progress. Prayer is doing nothing. Psychology is not really doing anything either. And as we get to know each other, well, it turns out this woman has a deep wound of growing up and feeling kind of neglected and specifically not special. That's the words that she used. She's just like, I'm not special. If you think about it for a second, as horrible as it probably would be to be the unwitting bride of Satan, it's kind of a special thing, right? It's pretty unique. And so she didn't have the motivation to let go of this. In my opinion, on that one, it was more of a delusion because of the need that it met for her. So this is the lesson I want to get across to you guys with this. Oftentimes, with any of our personal weaknesses, sometimes we wish they would go away, but we don't actually desire for them to go away. They serve a function in our lives. So think for just a moment about any bad habit that you have, any weakness that you have, and think about what's the function that it serves in your life. Every human behavior, whether it's voluntary or involuntary, serves a function of some kind. So whether it's pornography, anger, any kind of addiction, self-indulgence, that's kind of like being selfish. It's what function does it serve for you, and why? And that will give you insight into why letting it go is so hard, because it does something for you. A priest I know who doesn't want to be named gives the analogy of of germs entering the body. He says that evil wants to enter us through our spiritual wounds, just like germs want to enter us through our physical wounds. And so we all have this wounding, right, that we've been talking about. That's how evil wants to get in. And so think about, right, here we are, we're super socially distanced, we're wearing our masks, we're protecting ourselves. How much are you socially distancing from evil? And here's what I mean by this. How are you exposing yourself to things that magnify your unhappiness, things that hurt other people? In the counseling that I do I do a lot of counseling with men, and they'll talk about, pornography is a huge struggle for them. It's like diving into a petri dish of spiritual germs, right? It's an extreme example. You might not be doing something, overtly demonic, but even indulging in gossip, right? Who doesn't engage in a little gossip now and then? It's kind of like exposing yourself to these little tiny germs of evil. If you want to be freed, if you want to be like psychologically and spiritually healthy, we have to do our part to avoid the germs. So let's talk about the good stuff now. John Henry Newman talks about in his sermon on secret faults that he says, self-knowledge is at the root of all religious knowledge. Self-knowledge is at the root of all religious knowledge. He's basically saying if you don't know yourself, you can't really know God. That sounds kind of heretical, right? Well, the dude's a convert, so maybe he doesn't know what he's talking about. But then we have St. Teresa of Avila, who is a doctor of the church, happens to be my favorite saint. She says that two things are necessary for salvation. She says self-knowledge in God and prayer. The prayer part's kind of obvious, right? Let's talk about the self-knowledge. She goes on to say that self-knowledge is so important that, I'll read the quote because I don't have it memorized. Self-knowledge is so important that I wish that you never relax your cultivation of it. Even if you're raised right on up to the heavens, you must keep practicing it. Because you can't know God if you don't know yourself. And you can't know yourself, she goes on to talk about, if you don't know God. This makes perfect sense. Because God he's the one who crafted you. He's the one who created you. And so going to him and hearing what he has to say about you, who you are, is really, kind of makes sense, right? It's a profound way of coming to know yourself. That's why there's actually limitations to psychology. I spend a lot of my time, I've got a lot of secular therapist friends, and I'll spend a lot of time justifying the spiritual approach to life. To my fellow Catholics, I sometimes have to justify this psychological approach to life, but here's where there is a limitation. Psychology is kind of this self-contained thing. It can't see out beyond itself. It can't explain our suffering, as Michelle was talking about. There's no solution to suffering. Suffering is this meaningless thing. But if you don't understand yourself as being mind, body, and spirit, then you can't really know yourself deeply. And if you don't have a relationship with your maker, the one who handcrafted your special soul, well, then you can't really know what he has to say about you. Now, let me bring up kind of I think it's my third really important take-home point for the day, is the lens through which you see the world is also the lens with which you see yourself. It's the lens with which you see other relationships, and it's also the lens with which you see and experience God. And so if that lens is dirty, it's going to distort your understanding of God. And what dirties up the lens? It's our spiritual wounds. And so if we are trying to understand the Lord of the universe, this being who is love, through our purely broken and dirty lens, we're not going to have a clear and perfect relationship with him. Now, this is 100% human nature. This is unavoidable. But in extremes, it's not even extremes, and it can be quite damaging. So if your understanding of God is through this lens that is colored by the wounds of your childhood, you're going to see God as this part of the wounding, right? So think about what your own conception of God is. Who is God? Intellectually, most of us say God is love, God is our Father, but a lot of us experience God as sort of like a policeman God. Where does that come from? God's not a policeman. If you don't do this, there's going to be big consequences. Other people experience God as kind of like this grandpa God. The spirituality that life is just like Ferris wheels and lollipops. Well, that's not a true conception of God either, right? God calls us to be perfect. He wants us to be perfect. So doing work on yourself to find healing is not just important for your daily life. It's probably partly important for your salvation. It doesn't mean that wounded people don't go to heaven. Of course they can. But for you to truly, deeply experience God's love in your life, you got to do the work of healing your psychology. So I'll kind of wind down with this. I want you guys to do a reflection. And it will take literally like 90 seconds, and I want you to do it now. I want you to think, do a brief kind of survey of the wounds that you have in your life, the false self that kind of manifests in your life. I want you to think about those things, kind of hold it in your hand. And while you're holding it in your hand, I want you to ask yourself, I want you to ask God, I should say, I want you to ask God, who do you say that I am? This is one of the most important questions we can ask in our prayer. Who do you say that I am? Because who he says that we are tells us what to do. It tells us, just if you knew just for an instant how God saw you, what God believes about you, that would be like instant healing of every wound that you have. If you can answer this question for yourself, it's going to be a beautiful thing. So while we're working on this transition into break time, before you walk away for a break, just sit for a second and think about it. Maybe make notes for yourself about what you want to think about, what you want to take to some prayer and to some contemplation. Because remember this, there is no growth without vulnerability. Think of any time you've ever gotten better at anything in your life. It's always come through vulnerability, every time. And when we let go of that false self, that dragon self, and let ourselves be our true being, well, then we're free. So, who does God say that you are?